Ed Gein, known as the Butcher of Plainfield, was a killer and grave robber who created items from human remains, such as lampshades and a suit made of skin. His crimes were driven by a twisted obsession with his deceased mother. Gein's actions inspired several horror movie characters, including Norman Bates from Psycho and Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Though convicted of only 2 murders, his macabre activities left a lasting impact on popular culture. Ted Bundy, one of America's most infamous serial killers, was known for his charming persona, which he used to lure his victims. He often feigned injury, wearing a cast or sling, to gain their trust before abducting and killing them. Bundy once escaped from custody twice and acted as his own lawyer during his trial. Despite confessing to 30 murders, the true number of his victims remains unknown. He was executed in Florida's electric chair in 1989. John Wayne Gacy, dubbed the Killer Clown, performed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties and community events. Behind the mask, he was a brutal serial killer who sexually assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy buried most of his victims in the crawl space of his Chicago home. His dual life as a respected community member and sadistic killer shocked the nation. He was executed by lethal injection in 1994. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, was a notorious serial killer who terrorized Los Angeles and San Francisco in the mid-1980s. A fan of heavy metal music, particularly AC/DC. His crimes included home invasions, sexual assaults, and brutal murders, often accompanied by satanic rituals, which he left as a calling card. Ramirez's reign of terror ended when he was recognized and captured by a group of citizens who detained him until the police arrived. Convicted of 13 murders and numerous other felonies, Ramirez was sentenced to death. He spent 23 years on death row before dying of cancer in 2013, never having been executed. Albert Fish, also known as the Gray Man and the Brooklyn Vampire, was a serial killer and cannibal active in the early 20th century. Fish preyed on children, committing some of the most gruesome acts of sadism and cannibalism ever recorded. His crimes were exposed after he sent a horrifying letter to the mother of one of his victims, detailing how he had murdered and eaten her daughter. Fish's perverse activities extended to self-mutilation, with X-rays revealing numerous needles embedded in his pelvis. He was arrested, convicted of murder, and executed in the electric chair in 1936. Aileen Wuornos, one of the few female serial killers, murdered 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990. Wuornos, who worked as a prostitute, claimed that each killing was in self-defense against clients who attempted to rape her. Her troubled upbringing, marked by abuse and abandonment, contributed to her instability and eventual killing spree. Wuornos's life and crimes were depicted in the 2003 film Monster, starring Charlize Theron. Despite her claims of self-defense, Wuornos was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. She was executed by lethal injection in 2002. Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was a notorious serial killer who murdered 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. Dahmer's crimes involved not only murder, but also necrophilia, cannibalism, and the preservation of body parts. He lured his victims to his apartment with promises of money or companionship, where he drugged and killed them. Dahmer's horrifying actions were exposed when one of his victims escaped and led police to his apartment, revealing a scene of unimaginable horror. Dahmer was sentenced to 15 life terms in prison, but he was killed by a fellow inmate in 1994. H.H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett, is often regarded as America's first serial killer. During the late 19th century, Holmes built a hotel in Chicago that became known as the Murder Castle. The building was a labyrinth of secret passages, soundproof rooms, and trapdoors, all designed to murder his victims. Holmes lured visitors, especially women, during the 1893 World's Fair, killing them in gruesome ways. He confessed to 27 murders, though the actual number may be higher. Holmes was eventually arrested, convicted, and hanged in 1896, leaving behind a legacy of horror and intrigue. Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK Killer, bind, torture, kill, terrorized Wichita, Kansas from 1974 to 1991, committing 10 murders. Rader lived a double life, serving as a church president and a compliance officer, while secretly carrying out his brutal crimes. He taunted police and media with letters detailing his killings, relishing the fear he instilled in the community. Rader evaded capture for decades, until a floppy disk he sent to the police was traced back to him. He confessed to the murders and was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in 2005, where he remains in prison today. Pedro Alonso Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, is one of the most prolific serial killers in history, with an estimated 300 victims. Lopez targeted young girls in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru during the 1970s. He lured his victims with promises of gifts or work, then led them to isolated areas where he killed them. Lopez was captured in 1980, and during his confession, he led authorities to the graves of 53 of his victims. Despite his heinous crimes, Lopez was released from prison in 1998, and his whereabouts remain unknown, making him a terrifying figure in criminal history. Robert Hansen, known as the Butcher Baker, was an Alaskan serial killer who hunted his victims like game in the wilderness. Active during the 1970s and 1980s, Hansen abducted women, many of them sex workers, and flew them in his private plane to remote areas of Alaska. There, he would release them and hunt them down with a rifle, treating the murders as sport. Hansen's double life as a respected community member and a sadistic killer went undetected for years until a victim escaped and led police to him. Hansen confessed to 17 murders and was sentenced to 461 years in prison, where he died in 2014. Tsutomu Miyazaki, also known as the Otaku Murderer, was a Japanese serial killer who terrorized Tokyo in the late 1980s. Miyazaki abducted and murdered 4 young girls, mutilating their bodies and engaging in necrophilia. He also cannibalized parts of his victims and sent letters to the families, detailing his horrific acts. Miyazaki's crimes shocked Japan and exposed his deeply disturbed mind, fueled by an obsession with horror films and pornography. After his arrest, he was found to be mentally ill, but was still held responsible for his actions. Miyazaki was convicted and hanged in 2008. Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who murdered at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990. Chikatilo's brutal killings were marked by extreme violence and sexual sadism, often mutilating his victims after death. He evaded capture for years due to police incompetence and a lack of forensic technology in the Soviet Union. Chikatilo was finally caught after a massive manhunt and psychological profiling. He confessed to his crimes and was convicted in 1992. Chikatilo was executed by firing squad in 1994, leaving a legacy of horror that haunts Russia to this day. Jack Unterweger was an Austrian serial killer who used his notoriety as a reformed criminal and writer to cover up his continued killing spree. Unterweger was initially convicted of murder in 1974 but was released in 1990 after convincing authorities he had reformed. Upon release, he became a journalist, ironically reporting on his own murders of prostitutes in Austria, the US, and Europe. His facade of rehabilitation eventually crumbled when evidence linked him to multiple murders. Unterweger was convicted of 11 murders in 1994 and sentenced to life in prison. He committed suicide in his cell the night of his sentencing. Issei Sagawa, a Japanese cannibal, gained international notoriety after murdering and eating a fellow student in Paris in 1981. Sagawa, who had long harbored cannibalistic desires, lured Renee Hartevelt to his apartment, where he shot and dismembered her before consuming parts of her body. Declared legally insane, Sagawa was deported to Japan, where he was released because French authorities refused to hand over case files. Despite his horrific crime, Sagawa became a minor celebrity in Japan, writing books and appearing in interviews. His case remains a shocking example of legal loopholes and cultural fascination with the macabre. Jack the Ripper is one of history's most infamous and mysterious serial killers, responsible for the brutal murders of at least 5 women in London's Whitechapel district in 1888. The Ripper's victims, all prostitutes, were found with their throats cut and bodies mutilated, sparking widespread fear and speculation. Despite an extensive investigation, the Ripper was never caught, and his identity remains unknown. The case has inspired countless theories, books, and films, cementing Jack the Ripper as a dark icon of criminal history. The mystery surrounding the Ripper continues to fascinate and haunt the public to this day. Charles Manson, the leader of the infamous Manson family cult, orchestrated a series of brutal murders in 1969, including the infamous Tate LaBianca killings. Manson convinced his followers that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ and that they were destined to ignite a race war he called Helter Skelter. Although Manson did not personally commit the murders, his manipulation and control over his followers led to his conviction for first-degree murder. Manson's wild-eyed image and bizarre beliefs made him a symbol of the darker side of the 1960s counterculture. He spent the rest of his life in prison, dying in 2017. Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, is one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history, confessing to 71 murders, though he's suspected of more. Active mainly in the 1980s and 1990s, Ridgway targeted vulnerable women, particularly sex workers, along Washington's Green River. He often strangled his victims and dumped their bodies in remote areas. Ridgway evaded capture for decades, maintaining a facade of normalcy as a married man and a truck painter. He was finally apprehended in 2001 through DNA evidence and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty by cooperating with investigators. Karla Homolka, along with her then-husband Paul Bernardo, was responsible for the horrific torture, rape, and murder of 3 young women, including her own sister, in the early 1990s in Canada. Homolka played an active role in the crimes, but managed to strike a deal with prosecutors, testifying against Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence, a deal that later became known as the Deal with the Devil. The plea bargain sparked public outrage when videotapes surfaced showing Homolka's full participation in the crimes. After serving 12 years in prison, Homolka was released in 2005 and now lives a reclusive life, her past still a subject of controversy. David Berkowitz, infamously known as the Son of Sam, terrorized New York City in the summer of 1976, committing a series of random shootings that left 6 people dead and 7 others wounded. Berkowitz claimed that a demonic dog named Harvey, owned by his neighbor Sam Carr, commanded him to carry out the murders. His erratic letters to the police and press, signed Son of Sam, fueled a media frenzy and sparked a massive manhunt. Berkowitz was eventually caught through a parking ticket and confessed to the shootings. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms and remains in prison, where he has since claimed to have found religion. Harold Shipman, a British doctor, is believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in history, with estimates of his victims ranging from 250 to over 400. Known as Dr. Death, Shipman used his position to administer lethal doses of painkillers to his mostly elderly patients. His crimes went undetected for years, as he forged medical records and death certificates to cover his tracks. Shipman's killing spree was finally uncovered in 1998, when the suspicious death of one of his patients led to an investigation. He was convicted of 15 murders in 2000 and sentenced to life in prison, where he hanged himself in 2004. Matthew Milat, the great-nephew of notorious Australian serial killer Ivan Milat, continued his family's dark legacy by committing a brutal murder at the age of 17. In 2010, Milat lured his friend David Ochterlony into the Belanglo State Forest, the same location where his great-uncle murdered several backpackers. Milat attacked Ochterlony with an axe, recording the horrific event on his mobile phone while bragging about his crime. He showed no remorse, boasting that the Milat name would live on. Matthew was sentenced to 43 years in prison for his crime, making him one of Australia's youngest convicted killers and further cementing his family's infamy in criminal history. Anatoly Onoprienko, also known as the Terminator, was a Ukrainian serial killer responsible for 52 murders between 1989 and 1996. Onoprienko targeted entire families, often breaking into their homes at night, shooting his victims, and then setting their houses on fire to cover his tracks. His motive was believed to be a deep-seated hatred of society and an urge to eradicate it. Onoprienko was finally caught in 1996 after a massive manhunt and a tip-off from a relative. He confessed to his crimes and was sentenced to life imprisonment, dying of heart failure in 2013 while still incarcerated. Belle Gunness, also known as the Black Widow of the Midwest, was a Norwegian-American serial killer active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Gunness is believed to have killed at least 14 people, including her husbands, children, and suitors, often to collect life insurance payouts. She lured men to her Indiana farm through personal ads, then murdered them and disposed of their bodies. In 1908, a fire destroyed her home, and a headless body thought to be hers was found. But doubts about her death persist. Gunness's true fate remains one of the great mysteries of early 20th century crime. Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber, was a former mathematics professor turned domestic terrorist who conducted a nationwide bombing campaign from 1978 to 1995. He targeted individuals he believed were responsible for the industrial and technological advancement he loathed. Kaczynski's bombs killed 3 people and injured 23 others. His manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, was published by major newspapers, leading to his capture when his brother recognized his writing style. Kaczynski was sentenced to life in prison without parole in 1996, where he remains to this day. Please like and subscribe to Evil Exposed for more riveting stories.